are we, sir?
At another place in time, I think.
Open hailing frequencies, Lieutenant.
Message coming in, sir.
Put it on the view screen.
I've always felt it was part of Star Trek, and a very important part that has been long overlooked.
Oh, I thought it would make a terrific show for youngsters and for oldsters. It wouldn't make any difference because you could do the same kind of stories.
It was really different, and it was a pleasure to work on it, but frightening at the same time because you didn't want to do a lesser job than the public might expect.
Working.
One of the best things about the animated series is it's like buried treasure. It's like, you know, every fan of the original series knows that there are those 77 episodes, or however you want to count them out, and it's as if somebody said, hey, we just found this other episode that no one's ever seen before.
I think that Star Trek the Animated Series was really important because it kept Star Trek alive. It gave it to a whole new generation of viewers.
It was the last iteration, the last opportunity to play out that what can we do with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy and the others in an episodic sense before we went on to do the movies, where the movies all eventually ended up in this kind of long story arc.
And at the time, you know, it was real Star Trek. Cartoon, no cartoon. It had Shatner and Nimoy in it. As far as I was concerned, it was real Star Trek.
None of us ever said cartoon. Never. So we were going to do Star Trek.
To us by Roddenberry, and he wanted her to do the story editing because he felt very, very comfortable. She, as an assistant of his in the live action shows, she was terrific.
And we all just wanted to do Star Trek still. We had it in our bones, and no pun. But I mean, in 1969, when it went off the air, we felt unfinished. We hadn't had a chance to complete the next voyages we had in mind. And this was one way to do it, even though we didn't get the 5th year.
I mean, and then we ended up doing a show that basically was the same as the nighttime show, same writers in many cases, same actors, obviously, and the same audience, too.
Bones, any opinion?
There's some resemblance. I'm inclined to agree with the doctor, Captain.
The problem was the audience was all in their 20s and 30s, and our normal audience was like 8 to 10.
They're all teenagers and children.
The way I got involved in Star Trek the Animated Series was that I had previously worked with Dorothy Fontana on a show called The Sixth Sense, And one day, in the middle of a writer's strike, I was a young, starving writer in my early 20s. She called and said, "Do you want to write an episode of Star Trek?"
Well, that was a lucky or unlucky stroke of fortune. The Writers Guild happened to be on strike in 1973. During those early months, I think we went for about a 3-month strike. And that meant none of the writers could write, live-action dramas or comedies, whatever they were writing. But it did mean that we could hire them to write at least one script for animation without their becoming a member of that union. And so we turned to all our, not all, but many of our Star Trek regulars and said, "Do you want to do this?"
Our first script was by Sam Peoples. He had done the very first episode for the live show.
It's a starship, like nothing I've ever seen.
There were these 2 or 3 ideas I'd had for the original series that we had never done. And so now I could do them in the animated series. And one, of course, was the More Tribbles, More Troubles. And the other was BIM.
We got David Gerald to do 2. We got Margaret Armand to do 2. And several other people who had wanted to write Star Trek but hadn't gotten a chance on the original series came in and did something. Joyce Perry was one. Larry Brody, who was just starting out, was another.
Well, meeting Gene Roddenberry was an experience all in itself because I had been in the business just long enough to have encountered a lot of people who really crapped on writers. And now I'm in the office of a guy who to me is a legend, who is the most gracious, warm, friendly, sweet guy I've ever met, who respects everything that every writer does, listens closely to every word I say.
And I did mostly just sat behind his shoulder and looked at what he was doing and listened to what he was saying, and he'd make changes, and then he'd make some more changes.
I don't like it at all, sir. Nor do I, Mr. Scott. But we've got to do it.
Roddenberry was great. It was the only time that I can remember that we sold a show to a network, and the network didn't have any right to make any changes in the scripts. And that was heaven.
Everything went past Gene. He saw it all. But he wasn't there every day. When he had comments, he put them in. Otherwise, he just said, "It's fine, go for it." And we all did the show.
I do remember one day, it was getting pretty frightening. Lou and I talked, and I said, "Hey, if we don't get started pretty soon, we're dead in the water." And I said, "Well, I'll just see if I can tell that to Gene, So it happened, I think, the next day, and when we were going over things, and I said, "Gene, I have to talk to you." I says, "If we don't start this production this week, in the next couple of days, we've only got 6-week window here. We're not going to make the first deadline." He says, "That's it." He stood up, and he says, "I'm not going to bother you anymore." He was happy, and he walked out the door, and he left me. Thrilling to work with somebody like that.
Wait a minute. There is a method to this madness.
Please elaborate, Captain.
So the first approach was, how are we going to tell these stories? What form are we going to use? And the second one was, who are we going to use? And they opted to hire almost everybody except for poor Walter Koenig, but who did get a chance to write a script, which was the beginning of his writing career. So, it wasn't all that bad.
We could barely use all the characters they had to use in the shows. I mean, just the set characters. Anyway, he couldn't have fit into the damn little room we were recording in.
Nice to be back aboard, sir, and fitting the room again.
The glorious thing was getting them all together for the first recording session. I know that's of interest to the fans, and I think it's the first time they'd all been together one time in the same room, and it was a joyous occasion.
You don't know how good it is to have you back on the bridge, alive and well. We're as happy about it as you are, Jim.
I'll just tell you, I get chills up my spine anytime Leonard would do Spock, because he'd just get all serious and do that Spock voice, and fascinating, Captain.
Fascinating.
And he'd do that, and then of course Shatner is he's very playful.
You will remind me to report my conduct to the Federation, won't you, Mr. Spock?
Of course, Captain.
Shatner had one thing that was immensely important to him, and that was to be true to the original show, to make sure that we didn't do anything in our show that would not really work with the Bible.
It is our responsibility to take care of our own, just as it is your responsibility to take care of yours.
He's one of the hardest working actors I've ever seen in front of a microphone or in front of a camera. But, you know, he'd say, all right, we need a take, and he would just, bam, just like that, first time, right out. You know, that was perfect, Bill, one more, and he'd do it again.
Well done, Jim.
There were some actors who did multiple roles. Majel Barrett did. She did a lot of the female voices.
Well, I can't find anything wrong with these instruments, Doctor.
I am Thela, the head female. Hostile behavior doesn't fit its program. Oh.
Lieutenant Umres, I want a printout of the guidance computer's last orders.
Jimmy Doohan did a lot of voices that were other than his own, obviously, as Scotty. He was very good on other characters' voices that we would have had to bring in different voice actors, and Jimmy could do a wide range of not only types of voices, but types of accents.
No matter where I've traveled in the galaxy, Jim, this bridge is more like home than anywhere else.
We will live no longer like worms crawling in the dirt.
Good. All hands to battle stations.
And of course, my favorite is all the stuff that Nichelle got to do. I'm just in love with Nichelle. That's just me. And in the episode Bim, she shows her range. She gets to show Uhura being a very strong voice on the bridge, but then she does the voice of the alien intelligence, and she's a whole different character. And the range there is spectacular.
What gives you the right to intrude here?
Then in another episode, Uhura says that the men are all captured or something. They're not available.
What are you doing?
Taking command of this ship.
At last! She just had so much fun with that. And that goes back to who Nichelle is. So watching her stretch herself and grow as a performer, that was great.
Ship's log, supplemental. I am assuming command of the Enterprise.
Once the actors have recorded all the voices, then it can go to animation, to actual ink and pen, to be sketched out. Storyboards were being done at the time. Off the scripts, they were doing storyboards at the same time. So every script was storyboarded out, scene for scene, line for line.
Tactically well planned.
Putting an episode together from start to finish for our schedule was about 3 months. I know the animation was 6 weeks allowed for that.
Animation takes a long time, and there's a whole procedure. You have to write it, then you have to do storyboards, then you have to do layouts, then you have to do backgrounds, then you have to animate it. And we would start about 6 months prior to the first show going on the air and just deliver them in time. I mean, we were delivering wet, well, in those days it was film. I mean, when I say wet film, I mean, we'd ship out on Friday for Saturday morning. I mean, it was really gruesome.
Have you covered every possibility, every factor?
The facts remain unchangeable.
You had to keep that steamroller going in order to make the final deadline. You know, that's what I was saying earlier about working with Gene. You know, there was a certain time frame. If we didn't start, we were going to be late. You know, so.
Status, Mr. Spock?
All systems affirmative, Captain. The Enterprise is on course and on schedule.
Hal Sutherland, the dear man who was our director, was colorblind. We didn't know that. And as a result, on Larry Niven's The Slaver Weapon, his Kazinti, these are his creation. They are 8-foot orange cats, very fierce, very predatory, and they were flying around in a pink ship.
It will not be pleasant for her.
Which startled me when I saw it broadcast, and I immediately called Larry and apologized. I didn't know until that moment that Hal was colorblind and probably only saw that color as a shade of gray.
Captain, what happened? I would rather not discuss it.
The people who work on these things are artists. I mean, I had the joy of working with up to 2,000 artists over the time that we were in business. At one time, we had 875 artists working for us. And you could see your work on screen.
Fantastic architecture. Only an incredibly advanced race could have built it.
The show had a visual canvas that was, it sort of incorporated the original show, but it also expanded it into this realm that couldn't be done at the time.
We could do new and different creatures that actually still aren't being done as well as they were done in animation, because you could do anything. And the environments, underwater, all sorts of lovely things that we wouldn't have been able to easily do in live action.
You could show the most bizarre looking aliens that could never have been produced in the 60s or even the 70s. I mean, you had, it was Lieutenant Eriks, I guess, the three-limbed navigator who replaced Chekhov, who was a very interesting alien, a very cool design.
Well, in the episode Bem, in my original conception of Bem, which was going to be a live-action story, I had sketched a kind of a two-part creature that would be played by a very sturdy, short person who would be carrying a very shorter person on his back, and so you would have this character that could then split apart into two symbiotic creatures. In the animated series, we didn't have to worry about building a costume or finding the actors. The animators just had Bem split apart into as many different pieces as they needed.
I mean, the first time we saw a Vulcan city was in the episode Yesteryear. And then later on Enterprise, we did, in season 4, we did a 3-episode arc that took place on Vulcan. And we wanted to see that city again. It was Spock's hometown, and we thought, well, it'd be cool to visit it before Spock came along. So we brought that city to life. I think it was called Shikar. So the animated series had a look, I think, that certainly influenced later Star Treks.
I wish to visit the planet Vulcan, 30 Vulcan years past. The month of Tasmin. Location, near the city of Shikar.
I had some ideas that I'd always had for years about what Star Trek as a series should have, so I was ready to go with them. I decided to lead with my favorite, which was, why can't the Enterprise encounter God in space? Gene thought that was the greatest thing he'd ever heard of. He said, I've been trying for years to just get that out in that way. I never really thought about just doing it, so all right, let's do that. Go home, we're gonna make a deal. Well, a week later, Dorothy called me and said, the good news is that we're making a deal and you're going to write that episode we talked about. The bad news is we can't use God, but we can use the devil. So it became the magic of Magus 2, which was a story about a planet of devils.
Lovely primitive humans. Can't you do anything right?
Well, the thing that we could do is we could go anywhere and do anything we wanted to do as long as it could be drawn. Nowadays you can do it with computers, but in those days you did it by hand and pencil and paint. And Gene could write about or think about going any place he wanted in the universe, in any planet, any color, any shape, any size.
What we did have was a really good research company that pointed out when we contradicted ourselves, when something didn't follow. Remember, you said this over here and in this episode, and then over in this episode you're saying something else. Well, it has to follow. It has to make sense, and they have to agree. Okay, fine. So we did that.
We were doing Star Trek. We were doing the Star Trek as described in the Writer's Guide, and the Writer's Guide for the animated show was the same one we had for the live-action show, pretty much.
Something awfully familiar about it. What do you make of all this, Spock?
Well, my take on whether or not this fits into the Star Trek legacy is that it fits into my version of the Star Trek legacy. I mean, I think it should.
All this argument about canon is stupid. It has Gene Roddenberry's name on it. It has William Shatner as Kirk. It has Leonard Nimoy as Spock. It has D. Kelley as McCoy. It has Jimmy Doohan as Scotty. It has Majel Barrett as Nurse Chapel. It has Nichelle Nichols as Uhura. It has George Takei as Sulu.
We were fortunate to be in position in the last season of Enterprise as co-producers on the show to actually take some elements from the animated show and put it into live action on-air continuity so it becomes canon.
And one of the best examples of that was the Saylat, which had been seen in the animated series.
Mm-hmm. Mentioned in the original series.
But it was in Yesteryear, Dorothy Fontana's episode, which showed that really poignant glimpse of Spock's early years and with his pet. And he has an adventure out in the wilds of the Forge. And that became the episode. The Forge was the name of the episode we wrote for Enterprise. Mm-hmm. And we too included a Saylat.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first time we saw a holodeck was on the animated series. There was an episode, I believe it was called The Practical Joker, where the ship's computer went a little bonkers.
It is lovely, but I'm more in the mood for a nice, quiet walk in the woods.
I did an episode called Catwalk, and I think there were a couple of moments where I dropped in some references to the old show. One where our Dr. Phlox had these a lot of creatures in his sick bay, and he had some slugs, and we called them in a couple different episodes. We revealed that they were Edosian slugs, so they're from the same planet as Lieutenant Eric's. Although the reference I liked the most was the Kazwan ritual, which is what young Spock was going through in yesteryear. And there was a lovely little scene between Captain Archer and T'Pol. And the captain makes a reference about how it's a lot like going camping. And he asks T'Pol, well, have you ever gone camping? And she says, well, no, but she tells him a little bit about the Kazwan ritual and how she spent all these days in the desert. The Vulcan idea of camping.
Well, number one, I know the animated show helped the franchise because it helped give birth, because they suddenly realized there was an audience out there.
I love that at the time, the LA Times reviewed it, and though it was part of a Saturday morning lineup, they said it was a Mercedes in a soapbox derby.
NBC was elated, just absolutely elated. I remember getting a personal letter from them saying how wonderful the show looked and how happy they were at the results. I'd never heard anything like that in all the years we've been busy, 20-odd years.
It's the only Emmy I've ever gotten for a show. I did 1,500 half hours or whatever it was, and it really wasn't, it should not have been given to us. It was an Emmy for Best Children's Show Saturday morning, and it was not really a children's show. It was a show for the entire family, and anybody who was really a fan of the original live show, they recognized it.
My son overheard the rehearsals and here it was Captain Kangaroo, so I don't know what to say, except a very, very special thanks to my very, very special friend and co-producer, Norm Prescott, and my lovely family, my wife, Jay, my son, and my daughter, Lena and Erica, and all those great, great people who produce for us in the art of animation, that Filmation, those wonderful shows. Thank you very, very much.
I was pleased that it won the Emmy. It was the only Emmy we got. Star Trek was nominated a number of times, more in technical categories than anything else, which always insulted us because we felt we were doing really good drama. But I was pleased that we got an Emmy. I was thrilled to death.
Our trip into the negative universe gave it a second life. It gave all of us a second life.
When they were thinking that Star Trek was gone, when the series ended, the live show, and then all of a sudden the animated show came back, all their hopes became rejuvenated.
And to me that was important because I think it gave us a sense of closure that we just hadn't abruptly ended our 5-year mission, that we were still out there doing our job.
It was the Further Adventures. It was the 4th season that we didn't get to do live action, but we did get to do in a different way.
The reason why these animated series still holds up after all this time is the same reason the original series holds up all this time, and it's stories.
So I'm glad that, almost 40 years later we're still remembering it and honoring it, and I don't think we should forget the storytellers who worked on it.
These were the people who created the series in the first place. Most of us were involved, whether it was the writers, the actors, Gene himself. We were all there doing Star Trek.
Take us out of orbit, Mr. Sulu. Let's go home.
Captain, I'm picking up a message.
Go in peace. Yes, go in peace. You have learned much. Be proud.